They had been surrounded for days, deep inside the darkest forest of eastern France. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food had run out. German loudspeakers echoed through the fog, urging them to surrender, while wounded soldiers lay freezing on the forest floor with no way out. The men of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, were cut off behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue, and then, from a direction no one expected, help arrived from a unit whose own families sat behind barbed wire back home. This is the true story of the Lost Battalion and the Japanese-American regiment that refused to let them die. In October 1944, American forces were pushing through the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, one of the most brutal pieces of terrain anywhere in the European theater. Steep ridges towered over narrow trails, thick trees blocked line of sight, fog rolled in without warning, and freezing rain soaked everything. German forces had transformed the area around WWII and Bifontaine into a maze of fortified positions, mines, machine guns, and hidden artillery. The U.S. Army's orders were clear: advance through the forest, break German defensive lines, and open a path toward the German border. The responsibility fell to the 36th Infantry Division, a primarily Texas National Guard division that had already seen fierce fighting in Italy and southern France. The push into the forest was immediate and aggressive. Among the units advancing was the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment. They moved quickly, taking advantage of initial German withdrawals, but the forest swallowed entire companies, and visibility often shrank to only a few yards. Coordination became difficult, radio communication broke down as the terrain interfered with signals. Without knowing it, the 141st moved farther ahead than their supporting units. German forces recognized the gap and slipped behind them, sealing off the narrow trails and roadways. By October 24th, the battalion realized that German troops had completely encircled them. Withdrawal was impossible. Every attempt to move back toward friendly lines was met with machine gun fire and mortar blasts. The narrow ridges had become death traps. The men dug defensive positions as best they could, forming a shrinking perimeter. Roughly 275 soldiers were now trapped miles behind enemy lines, cut off from resupply, and surrounded on all sides. Inside the encirclement, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food was gone by the second day. Some men tried to stretch their rations, but there simply wasn't enough to go around. Water had to come from puddles, helmets, and captured rainwater. Ammunition, the lifeline of any isolated unit, began to run out even faster. The Germans taunted them with recorded messages, urging them to surrender and promising humane treatment. The men ignored every call. They were Texans, hardened by war, determined to hold their ground. U.S. artillery units attempted to drop supplies to the trap battalion, but the dense canopy and bad weather caused many drops to miss their mark. Some bundles parachuted directly into German positions. Others landed on slopes that were impossible to reach under fire. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Several wounded men could not be moved to safer locations and had to be treated with whatever materials were available. For the battalion, this was now a fight for survival. Outside the pocket, American commanders launched multiple attempts to break through the German lines and reach the trapped soldiers. 2 infantry battalions pushed forward, trying to carve a path through the forest. The Germans held the high ground and used the terrain to their advantage. Every American advance encountered mines, barbed wire, and overlapping machine gun fire. Casualties mounted and progress stopped. Standard infantry units could not break the German defenses. Something different was needed. High command turned to a unit that had already proven itself in some of the hardest fighting of the war, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Composed mostly of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, the 442nd had built a reputation for pushing through impossible terrain and breaking fortified German positions. Their performance in Italy and southern France had earned them enormous respect on the battlefield. What most of America did not realize at the time was that many of these soldiers had families living behind barbed wire in U.S. internment camps, imprisoned because of wartime fear and prejudice. Yet the men of the 442nd volunteered to fight anyway, determined to prove their loyalty. At the moment the Lost Battalion became trapped, the 442nd had just finished heavy fighting around Bruyères and Bifontaine. They were exhausted. Many soldiers were running on little rest. Their uniforms were soaked from days of rain, and their boots were worn down from harsh terrain. They expected a temporary break to recover. Instead, General John Dahlquist ordered them back into action immediately. They were to break through German lines and rescue the encircled battalion, no matter the cost. The order shocked the men. They had barely had time to catch their breath. But there was no hesitation. The regiment prepared to move out at once. They understood the stakes clearly. Hundreds of American soldiers were on the brink of annihilation. If they did not act quickly, the lost battalion would be overrun or forced to surrender. The 442nd entered the Vosges forest under some of the worst conditions imaginable. Rain fell in sheets. Fog clung to the ground, reducing visibility so much that soldiers sometimes could not see 10 feet ahead. The forest floor was a mix of mud, roots, and fallen branches. Every step had to be watched for mines. German snipers moved between trees, firing from hidden angles. Machine gun nests were dug into ridges overlooking the narrow trails. Mortars and artillery struck with little warning, detonating against tree limbs and showering the men with deadly wooden splinters. The regiment advanced anyway, pushing uphill toward the German strongpoints that had stopped every previous rescue attempt. The terrain favored the defenders completely, and the Germans knew it. But the 442nd had built its reputation on succeeding where others could not. Their mission was simple: break the line, reach the trapped battalion, and bring them home. As they climbed the first ridge under fire, the battle for the lost battalion began in full force. The forest roared with explosions, rifle fire, and shouted commands. The Germans were determined to hold their positions. The 442nd was determined to push through them. The fight had begun, and it would be one of the hardest battles they would ever face. The deeper the 442nd pushed into the Vosges forest, the worse the fighting became. Every ridge was defended. Every trail was mined. German machine gun positions were arranged in layers, forcing the regiment to take fire from multiple angles at once. The forest absorbed sound, making it impossible to judge enemy distance. Soldiers advanced tree by tree, yard by yard. Progress was measured not in miles, but in blood and exhaustion. The men understood instantly why 2 previous rescue attempts had failed. This was one of the most difficult battlefields the U.S. Army had faced in Europe. German resistance stiffened as the 442nd climbed toward the positions guarding the route to the lost battalion. Most German units in the area belonged to experienced formations, familiar with the terrain. They used every advantage the forest gave them. Snipers targeted officers. Mortar teams shifted positions constantly. Hidden bunkers allowed machine gunners to fire long bursts before vanishing into the trees. The 442nd responded with relentless forward pressure, attacking in small groups, maneuvering between tree trunks, and using captured positions as footholds for the next push. As the regiment closed in on the ridges shielding the lost battalion, one particular German defensive line proved nearly impossible to breach. It overlooked the narrow approaches the Americans were forced to use, giving the defenders a perfect field of fire. Several attempts to flank the position were shattered by mines and targeted mortar strikes. Casualties rose sharply. Medics crawled through mud and branches under fire to reach the wounded. The forest floor became a mixture of churned earth, broken equipment, and splintered wood. Despite the mounting danger, the regiment refused to pause. They understood the situation clearly. The men of the 141st had already been trapped for days, with limited food, little water, and dwindling ammunition. Every hour mattered. German units were tightening the ring around the trapped Texans, and sooner or later they would launch a full assault to finish them. The rescue needed to happen immediately. On the morning of October 29th, the 442nd launched one of the most intense assaults of their campaign. Soldiers from multiple companies moved forward in a coordinated push, aiming directly at the heart of the German line. The terrain offered almost no cover. Fog lifted just enough for German gunners to see movement. The air filled with machine gun tracers and mortar blasts. Men advanced anyway, climbing slopes under fire, diving behind fallen logs, and returning fire at muzzle flashes hidden between the trees. It was one of the few moments in the campaign when sheer determination overcame terrain and firepower. Surviving soldiers later described this attack as the moment when the regiment forced its way through what had been considered an unbreakable German position. The charge was not reckless. It was disciplined, coordinated, and brutally effective. The 442nd drove into the defensive line with such force that enemy units began to fall back. After hours of relentless fighting, the position that had held off 2 American battalions finally cracked. The path toward the lost battalion began to open. With the defensive line breached, the 442nd pressed forward without hesitation. They were now within reach of the trapped Texans. German resistance remained fierce, but the momentum had shifted. The regiment moved through the forest, clearing pockets of opposition and securing the high ground. Scouts pushed ahead, searching for signs of the encircled battalion. The forest remained silent except for distant gunfire and the sound of boots dragging through mud. On October 30th, 1944, the first elements of the 442nd made contact with the perimeter of the lost battalion. What they found was a group of exhausted, starving, and wounded soldiers holding a defensive ring that had shrunk day by day. The Texans were stunned when Japanese-American troops appeared out of the fog. Many had expected the rescue attempts to fail. Instead, they were staring at the men who had broken through some of the toughest terrain and most fortified positions in the region to reach them. Of the roughly 275 men who had originally been surrounded, only 211 were still able to walk or stand. The rest had been killed, wounded, or captured during the 6-day isolation. The sight of friendly soldiers reaching their lines brought immediate relief. Some men cried, others smiled silently. Many simply collapsed from exhaustion. Medics began treating the wounded, while officers confirmed the pocket was secure. The mission had succeeded. The lost battalion had been saved. The cost of that success was staggering. During the rescue operations, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered over 800 casualties. Some estimates place the number even higher when including all killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated due to exhaustion and exposure. In practical terms, this meant the regiment took several casualties for every 1 man rescued. It was one of the highest human costs of any rescue mission carried out by American forces in the European theater. The regiment did not dwell on losses. The men gathered their equipment, reorganized, and prepared for further operations. The surviving Texans were moved to safer positions to receive medical care and rest. Officers from the 36th Infantry Division formally thanked the 442nd for their actions. Many soldiers from the Texas Battalion would remember the rescue for the rest of their lives. They understood that without the relentless push of the 442nd, their battalion would likely have been destroyed or captured. In the weeks that followed, the significance of the rescue began to spread throughout the division and eventually the entire army. The 442nd had once again proven itself under the harshest conditions imaginable. Their performance in the Vosges Mountains became one of the defining moments in their history. The regiment would go on to earn an extraordinary number of decorations, including multiple presidential unit citations, medals of honor, and countless individual awards for bravery. By the end of the war, the 442nd had become the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. For the men who fought in the rescue, the mission carried a deeper meaning. Many had volunteered from internment camps where their families had been confined. They had endured prejudice, doubt, and suspicion, yet on the battlefield, they were among the most trusted, dependable, and courageous soldiers in the U.S. Army. Their rescue of the lost battalion demonstrated commitment and sacrifice in a way that resonated far beyond the war itself. The Vosges campaign remains one of the clearest examples of bravery in the face of near insurmountable odds. The terrain, weather, and enemy fortifications created a battlefield designed to break attacking forces. The 442nd pushed through it anyway. They advanced when every other unit had been stopped cold. They carried wounded comrades on their backs through mud and rain. They broke a German defensive ring that seemed impenetrable. And they did it all knowing that the men they were trying to save were running out of time. The rescue of the lost battalion stands as a testament to courage, loyalty, and determination. It reveals the extremes of what soldiers endured during World War II and the lengths they would go to protect one another. The men of the 141st fought to stay alive. The men of the 442nd fought to reach them. Together, they became part of a story that continues to be remembered 80 years later for its sacrifice and heroism. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.